The county records office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, and Camila had been standing at the same counter for almost 10 minutes, staring at a printout she'd asked for on a whim. The kind of impulsive curiosity that usually led nowhere. This time, it had led somewhere she wasn't prepared for. Walter Higgins. The name sat at the top of a list of property owners on her own block, and it kept appearing again and again next to address after address, until she'd counted 6 separate properties before she stopped trusting her own counting and started over from the top. 6. Not rented, owned outright, according to the clerk who'd printed it for her with the bored efficiency of someone who handled requests like this all day and had long since stopped finding any of it interesting. Camila read the name a third time, half convinced it had to be a different Walter Higgins, some coincidence, a father or an uncle sharing the same name as the man she waved to most mornings from her balcony. But the middle initial matched. The birth year, when she quietly did the math in her head, matched too. It was him. The same Walt in the same faded flannel jacket, the same 20-year-old pickup truck she sometimes heard cough to life in the early morning before he backed it out of his driveway. She folded the paper into her bag, walked out into the parking lot, and sat in her car for a long moment before starting the engine, trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same man that refused to sit still next to each other in her head. None of this would have made a single bit of sense to her 3 weeks earlier. Camila was 28, 2 years into a marketing job that paid comfortably enough, renting an apartment specifically chosen because it photographed well, driving a car she'd financed the month she got promoted, mostly because the old one, in her own words at the time, didn't look like where she was headed. She'd absorbed, without ever really examining it, the belief that success was supposed to leave visible fingerprints. That was sort of the entire point of having it. What good was doing well if nobody could tell? It hadn't always felt like a belief. It had felt like common sense, the kind so obvious nobody bothered stating it out loud. Dress a certain way, drive a certain thing, post the right photo at the right angle, and the world adjusted its opinion of you accordingly, usually upward, usually quickly. The first real crack in that belief happened on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, watering the small collection of plants crowding her narrow balcony. Across the street, Walt was loading something into the bed of his truck, moving slowly the way people do when their knees have opinions about the weather. She waved, the way she always did, and thought, not unkindly, more automatically than anything, the kind of thought that passes through a person without ever being examined, that he must have a hard life. Old truck, same 3 shirts on a loose rotation she'd noticed without meaning to. Nothing about him signaled anything except just getting by. And she'd filed that impression away without a second thought, the way you file away 100 other small judgments about strangers every single week. A week after that came the community meeting, one of those dry municipal evenings about a proposed zoning change nobody in the room particularly wanted to attend, but everyone felt obligated to. Camila had gone mostly because it was 2 blocks from her apartment, and she'd told herself she should be more civically involved. Before the meeting officially started, she overheard 2 city officials talking near the coffee urn, half joking, low-voiced, about how nothing on that particular block would move forward without Higgins weighing in first, since he apparently owned most of it outright. Camila had actually looked around the room for whoever they meant, some half-formed expectation of a man in a good suit, someone who looked the part. Nobody like that was anywhere in sight. Just a handful of retirees, a couple of young parents there about a playground, and Walt, sitting quietly near the back in that same flannel jacket, saying almost nothing for the entire hour and a half, occasionally nodding at something someone else said. She caught up with him in the parking lot afterward, more out of confused curiosity than any real plan of what to say. "I didn't realize you owned property around here," she said, trying and mostly failing to sound casual about it. He looked at her for a second, not offended, just quietly amused in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had said almost exactly that sentence to him. Most people don't realize that. Is that on purpose? He leaned back against the tailgate of his truck, considering the question longer than she expected. You ever read Machiavelli? She hadn't, not really, beyond a vague high school memory involving the phrase, "the ends justify the means," which she suspected wasn't even the actual point of the book, just the part that survived in pop culture long after everything else got forgotten. Everybody thinks that book's about being cruel, Walt said. It's really about being seen accurately, or not being seen at all, depending on which one keeps you safer. He wrote that most people judge with their eyes, not their hands. They see what you appear to be. Almost nobody ever gets close enough to actually touch what you are underneath it. Most of the time, that gap between the two is the entire game, whether anybody realizes they're playing it or not. Camila frowned, turning that over. So you just dress like this? Drive that truck? On purpose? This whole time? Same 3 or 4 shirts, replaced with the exact same style each time they wear out, Walt said, entirely unembarrassed. Same truck, since it still runs fine, and I see no reason to replace something that isn't broken. I could drive something else tomorrow if I wanted to. I choose not to, every single day. Same as choosing anything else. Why would anyone choose that, though, if you could have more? He thought about it for a moment, the way someone decides how much of an answer a person is actually ready to hear. Machiavelli spent a good part of that book warning rulers about one thing more than almost anything else: not losing a war, not even being disliked necessarily, being envied. He wrote that a prince could survive being feared, could sometimes even survive being disliked if it came to that. But hatred, the specific kind that grows out of envy, that's the one thing he said actually gets you overthrown. People don't usually come for what you have, not directly. They come for what you have that they can see you have. The rest, they mostly leave alone because it never occurred to them it was there. That single idea followed Camila home that night and refused to leave quietly. She lay in bed thinking about her own leased car, chosen specifically to be noticed. She thought about a coworker who'd once made an offhand comment about her clearly doing well, and how genuinely good that comment had felt in the moment, warm even, a little glow that lasted the rest of the afternoon. Replaying it now, she felt something closer to unease, knowing a man in a 20-year-old truck had quietly outbuilt half the people in that office making comments exactly like it, without a single one of them ever suspecting. She started seeking Walt out over the following weeks, carefully, never asking about actual numbers, just circling the edges of how he thought about things. He never seemed to mind the questions, though he was never specific about what anything was worth. "Nobody asks me for money," he told her one afternoon, working on something under the hood of his truck in his driveway, while she leaned against the fence nearby, sipping iced tea he'd handed her without asking if she wanted it. "Nobody tries to sell me investments I've never heard of. No distant cousin suddenly remembers my birthday the same month I mentioned doing well at anything. You know why that is? Why? Because nobody thinks I've got anything worth asking for." He wiped grease off his hands with a rag that had clearly seen decades of exactly this. Machiavelli talked about a prince needing to be like a fox and a lion, both at once. Fox, to spot a trap before anyone's finished setting it. Lion, strong enough that most people never even bother trying, because the cost of trying looks too high to be worth it. Looking like this, he gestured down at his own jacket, the same faded green he'd worn every single time she'd seen him, means I almost never have to actually be the lion. People just don't come looking in the first place. The whole fight gets avoided before it ever starts. Camila thought about the exact opposite of that arrangement, playing out in her own life without her ever having named it before. A friend who'd asked to borrow $400 the same month Camila had posted a photo of a new couch. A distant relative who'd suddenly reappeared, warm and curious, right around the time she'd mentioned her promotion at a family dinner. None of it had felt connected at the time. Each incident had seemed like its own small, unrelated thing. Now, laid out next to each other in her head, it looked less like coincidence and more like a pattern she'd simply never had the framework to notice, because nobody had ever handed her the framework in the first place. So what? Everybody should just drive an old truck and wear the same shirts forever? She asked, half joking, testing the edges of the idea. No, Walt said, without hesitation, like he'd corrected this exact misunderstanding plenty of times before. That's not the actual rule, and it never was. The rule is knowing the difference between what you actually have and what you choose to show, and making that choice on purpose, not by accident, not because it's just what everybody around you happens to be doing. Most people never decide anything about it at all. They just show everything, because somewhere along the way, they were taught that's what success is supposed to look like. And they never once stopped to ask who's actually watching, or why it might matter that they are. A few months after that conversation, Camila did something small, almost embarrassingly small, measured against how large the realization had felt. She let her car lease run out and replaced it with something plain and reliable, nothing anyone would comment on in either direction. She didn't announce it to anyone. Nobody at the office seemed to notice at all, which struck her as strange the first week, and then, slowly, started to feel like exactly the point. The real test of all of it came at a work event a few months later. One of those evenings everyone spends quietly comparing apartments and vacations without a single person ever saying so out loud. A coworker, a genuinely kind one, asked her, not unkindly, whether everything was okay, gesturing vaguely at her plain outfit and the ordinary car she'd parked outside. There was real pity woven into the question, the exact same flavor of pity Camila herself used to feel, watching Walt load boxes into his truck bed on an ordinary Tuesday. She felt the old instinct rise up fast and familiar, explain herself, correct the impression immediately, make absolutely sure nobody in that room mistook her for someone who was struggling. She didn't do it. She just smiled, said she was doing fine, and let the moment pass exactly the way it wanted to pass, without chasing it down to fix it. Walking to her car afterward, alone in a parking lot lit by one flickering street lamp, she thought about how strange it felt to let somebody believe less of her than was actually true, and how much lighter that strangeness felt compared to the years she'd spent making absolutely sure everyone believed exactly the right amount about her. Or, more honestly, a little more than the right amount. She stopped by Walt's place not long after, mostly just to tell him about it, unsure why it felt important enough to drive over and say out loud instead of letting it sit quietly in her own head. He was on his porch, same flannel, same unhurried half smile, like he'd been expecting her to eventually show up with exactly this kind of story. Someone felt sorry for me tonight, she told him, sitting down on the step below his without being asked. Because of my car, my whole everything, honestly. How'd that feel? She actually thought about it before answering, instead of reaching for the easy response. Kind of good, weirdly. Lighter than I expected. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a person has just passed a test they hadn't announced they were giving. Now you're starting to get it. They sat there for a while without saying much, the porch light humming faintly above them, the same porch she used to glance at from across the street without ever really seeing what was actually sitting on it. You're going to spend the rest of your life watching people, Walt finally said, spend money they don't have, to look like they have money they haven't earned yet, in order to impress people who were never once going to help them anyway. Machiavelli wasn't really writing about money, not directly. He was writing about power, and about how easily people confuse the appearance of a thing for the thing itself. It's the exact same trap. It just wears a different coat, depending on the century. Camila looked across the street at her own apartment, the one she used to photograph so carefully from 3 different angles before choosing the best one, and thought about how much of the last 2 years had gone into managing what other people saw of her instead of actually building anything real underneath it. A year later, almost to the week, a new coworker joined Camila's team. Sharp, eager, the kind of 24-year-old who talked openly about wanting to look like she was winning before she'd even gotten her first real paycheck. Camila recognized the exact shape of it immediately, because she'd been standing in that shape herself not so long ago. She didn't lecture her. She just told her about a man in a flannel jacket and a 20-year-old truck, and a piece of paper in a county records office that had once rearranged everything Camilla thought she understood about who actually has something and who's simply spending the loudest. The younger woman didn't fully believe it at first. Camila hadn't either, standing frozen in that records office with a printout shaking slightly in her hand. Some things only make sense the first time you're the one holding the paper, staring at a name you thought you already knew everything about.